Thank you very much. Again, my name is Peter Evans, and I'm the Vice President for a new think tank called the Center for Global Enterprise. It was established about 3 years ago by the former CEO of IBM, Sam Palmisano. He retired and decided rather than to play golf, he'd launch a think tank. And we have an interesting board. Jerry Yang, the founder of Yahoo, is on our board. Michael Spence, who won the Nobel Prize in economics as well, and Shelley Lazarus, who was the first CEO of a major PR firm, Ogilvy, is also on our board. And we look at issues related to global management, sort of applied management learning. This morning I was on a video feed with our first course that we're teaching on entrepreneurship in Africa. Around platform development. I just released a report last week on the rise of platforms in Africa, which is quite interesting. So this notion of the digital divide that a lot of people had a lot of concern about still exists, but it's actually not as dramatic as you might imagine given the just explosion of cell phones and connectivity in Africa, and there's a bunch of platform companies emerging in that space. So we are launched kind of a mini micro course for entrepreneurs in Africa focused on that. So what I'm going to do today is share with you 2 years of research that I've been doing with leading platform scholars around the world to try to get a handle on how big is the platform economy. There's a lot of buzz about it, not just in the Valley, but all over the world. And we're seeing a growth. And what I'm going to do is share with you the results of a global survey that we did, and then some context and some insights around how platforms operate, and they can scale, right? You can start really small and have small platforms, you have very big ones, and what we're seeing increasingly is nesting of platforms. So it's an interesting listening this morning, let's talk about the small businesses, but small businesses often rely on the larger ecosystems of big businesses. In fact, our previous presentation was a lot about the tools a big platform provides to smaller companies. So without further ado, what I thought I'd do is, since I lean toward to the academic side of things and spent a lot of time researching, I always like to get to the foundation of who are the key scholars that help us understand these phenomena. I mean, there are lots of people out there doing it, but it's also useful to understand some of the core ideas because that saves you the trouble of reinventing the wheel. So if you don't want to reinvent the wheel, these are 3 people to know about. Ronald Coase, very famous paper he wrote on the theory of the firm, and he's one of the key thinkers around transaction costs. And one of the beauties of platforms is that they crush transaction costs. And that's what you should be thinking about. And really successful businesses are all about reducing friction. I mean, that's kind of the lay term for it. But in economics, they call it transaction costs. And Ronald Coase, and he had a theory of why firms exist. Well, they bring activity inside the boundary of the firm because it's cheaper and easier, less friction. But what we're finding is that platforms actually change that dynamic, and a lot of value is created outside the boundaries of the firm. And so we're having to rethink strategy. We're having to rethink what is a firm, and it's very interesting. And so I think one area I've gotten very interested in is what is the 21st century firm? And it's going to be different from the firms of the past. Another person is Jean Triol, and he won the Nobel Prize recently, and his work has been on the economics and understanding pricing models for double-sided markets. A third is Robert Metcalfe, and his work focused on this idea of networks and the power of networks. And so these are foundational people. And I built a database of platform scholars, and I've identified more than 1,000 authors of platform publications. And from that, many collaborations, many platform papers are co-written. And so there are about 660 articles in this database. And I work with a startup here in San Francisco called Quid. And what they do is help me graph that. I like putting things on one slide so you can see what's going on. And so this has been filtered down to authors that have co-authored with at least 4 other authors. And this is really the crux or the key authors that have advanced the platform scholarship. And what you'll see is Annabelle Gower and Mike Cusimano, or kind of pioneers. They focus largely on product platforms, but have also extended their work into matching place platforms as well. I co-authored a paper with Annabelle Gower, and we published that in January on this global survey. Mike Cusimano is now in Japan, and he's actually going to put together an entrepreneurship conference, and we're thinking about putting together a track on platforms, which would be quite exciting. Jean Triol, as I mentioned, won the Nobel Prize, and he's the largest node. You can imagine once you win the Nobel Prize, you get lots of people citing your work, and so you can see why he's central. He wrote a very famous paper, and that's that citation. But there's been a proliferation of books. Most recently, Platform Revolution was just published last month. Highly recommend that book, and I'm working with the authors of that book to co-host a conference this year in July at MIT called the Executive Platform Strategy Summit. It's a really interesting conference, mostly CEOs presenting on how you form platforms, what a platform management mean. We're going to have a VC panel on how do VCs evaluate platforms. It's going to be really an interesting meeting. Matchmakers has just come out. I just got my copy last week. This is David Evans and Dick Smolensky, and they write a lot on platforms, so that's an interesting book to look at. And then this book hasn't been released yet, but it should be in the next few weeks, and this is Arun Sundararajan, and he's focused on the share economy. So it's interesting, people use different languages, but they're basically talking about the same underlying function. I prefer platforms because it has predictive and better analytic power. I don't find the share economy helps me very much understand and predict what's going on, so I prefer platforms, but they're basically talking about similar things. So I thought I'd share that with you. So why are platforms emerging today? There are a bunch of forces at work, but I have been focused, or think that a couple of them are particularly relevant. One is that we're living in this age of networks. And we had, with the first industrial revolution, right, the physical networks set up, where you've got railroads, you've got pipelines, we've got power grids, all that kind of physical stuff. And on top of that, now we're building these communication networks and the internet, and obviously with mobile, we're untethering ourselves from wires and things of that nature. And that's creating this foundation on which companies can build new businesses. And you can see a real close relationship between when a network is built and then the businesses that can be built on top of that. And then we're living in an age of data. It's just easier to get data, process it, store it, and you know the story about the declining costs of data. And then we're seeing also the proliferation of platforms. So we're living in this age of platforms, and I'm going to show you sort of the value of some of the platforms that we see globally. And this is really the spread of ideas, I think, is that we see success, others copy it, innovate on it, and replicate it. And so we're seeing this expansion of platforms, platform ideas or platform thinking around the world. So definitions, there are a variety of definitions out there regarding what is a platform, but there's a couple essential features that are illustrated by the companies up here that I've got their logos for. But what's really interesting is the expansion into different sectors, right? Platforms really emerged in matching around media, for newspapers, music, dating, things of that nature, but we're now seeing it penetrate into other sectors like transportation with a connected vehicle, even into industrial spaces, and then in the workplace. I mean, there's just been an explosion of workplace platforms that match various people looking for jobs, and it's not just logo designers and web designers, but now it's going into field service engineers. So if you need people to service an HVAC machines on top of roofs, there's a platform for that. It's pretty amazing. So we're seeing the expansion also geographically, which I'll discuss. So definitions, clearly a matching function is a key attribute of platforms, and that is efficiently bringing two sides of a market together, right? And the platforms invest heavily in facilitating that matching function. The other is interaction, right? In the old days, firms really kind of bought raw materials, processed them, and then resold them, or if you're a service firm, you sold the services. And it wasn't very much effort to try to get the various customers together to facilitate exchange by the customers, but it turns out that there's tremendous value in doing that. And so lots of successful platforms have found mechanisms to actually help their ecosystem that they're developing interact with each other, share that information, use that information. And then finally, there's an innovation component. A really important feature of platforms is the ability to accelerate innovation. And how has that happened? If you're familiar with the kind of the open innovation literature, it's about opening your company up to allow third parties to build applications in your system. You know, and APIs have become very popular for that reason, because it allows you to accelerate your innovation process, and you're not bound by just what you have in your organization. You can tap into the ideas and capabilities of many parties. And so we heard this morning of the millions of apps now that are housed in these app stores that wouldn't have been possible if Google and Apple and others had just tried to do it with software engineers in their own organization. So extending, and that goes again to this point of the boundaries of the firm changing. Right? It's no longer just about what happens inside your firm. It's about how that ecosystem that you can create outside. So just to highlight the network effects and the power of network effects, and this is Metcalfe again in his work. You have 2 phones, you have 1 connection. You have 5 phones, you have 10 connections. What happens if you go to 12 phones? Turns out you get 66 connections. So you can see this power of network effects, and these platforms really accelerate, and actually the more value is created, the more participants on the platform. So this is part of the challenge in the early days, is how do you move up that scale, and the implications are quite significant, and the question is how do you get that inflection point. This is the user base of LinkedIn today, and it illustrates the power of networks. So here, what was it, 2003, 2004 is when LinkedIn started. There were only 10 members when it first started. Today, this is the latest data, 430 million people now are on LinkedIn. Right? And you can see that inflection. It hit really around 2008, 2009, 2010, and it really took off. And now it's really hard to imagine another company coming in and being able to provide a professional service network to compete against LinkedIn, right? Because there's so much value of the networks that are already existing there. And LinkedIn has been spending a lot of time and effort to build out language capabilities. So if you're just an English speaker, you only see part of LinkedIn's network connections. If you go to Chinese or other languages, there's a whole other networks that exist. LinkedIn's goal is by 2020 to have all knowledge workers in the world on their platform, which is a pretty startling goal, but they're pretty close to, I think people estimate there's about 600 million kind of elite knowledge workers in the world. Okay, so turning to this platform survey that I mentioned, it's hard work to figure out what is a platform and what is not a platform, and then to have the domain expertise or just the time and effort that it takes to sort through hundreds of companies to figure out which is a platform in these various regions, and also the domain expertise to understand the platform dynamics. And so the way I tackled this project was to reach out and develop relationships with leading scholars. So I mentioned Annabelle Gower, who's in the UK. What's his name? Weru Chen is at CBIS, which is the business school in Shanghai. And I found him through a connection I had with the chief strategy officer at Alibaba. He doesn't publish in English, so I didn't know about him, but he speaks English, and he's written several books, and one of them is a bestseller in China, because there's a tremendous amount of interest in platforms in China and Asia. And so I was able to hook up with him and learned a ton about what's going on in China, which is, there's a lot going on regarding platforms. Sanjit Pal Chaudhry, if you follow platforms, you may know of him. He's got a blog. I think he's got 20,000 followers. He's pretty prolific, and he's a co-author with Jeff Parker and Marshall Van Alstyne on that book, Platform Revolution. He's helped me understand the India context. And then I'm working with Oyalunka David West, she's at the Lagos Business School, and we've built a database of African platform companies, which is quite interesting. And then Jeff Parker, who is also co-author in the Platform Revolution. Anyway, so together we've been working on this. And so what I'll do is share with you the results. So we've set a kind of a benchmark or criteria marker for which companies to include and which to exclude, and we picked $1 billion in market cap as the threshold, just to keep the database manageable. And when you roll that up, you get a market cap of $3 trillion. So that tells you the size and scale, or at least the significance that platform companies have become. They're no longer just these little internet companies. They're truly, some of them are very, very large and have significant economic weight. They do billions of dollars in transactions a year, or facilitate billions of dollars in a whole variety of sectors, and I'll talk about which sectors in a minute. They employ 1.5 million people directly, and this is just a publicly traded. I wasn't able to get data on the privately held platform companies. I have some financial data, but it's very hard to know how many employees they actually have. But anyway, they employ millions more indirectly, because again, this value that they create outside the boundaries of the firm. So it's really hard to understand exactly what is the employment number, because direct jobs don't equate to the full value impact of the platforms. So this is a Tableau bubble chart of taking those 176 companies and separating them into their publicly traded bucket and their privately traded. And what's really interesting is that you get tons of attention to Uber and Airbnb, but you can see that they're actually only these little bubbles up there. I think people gravitate to them because their business models are pretty easy for the general public to understand, and there's tons written about them every day. But the reality is that they're just two of a large number, and they're not even close to being the most significant in terms of market capitalization out there. Sectors. So, you know, platforms have made inroads into certain sectors more deeply than others. The top category, and this is in terms of numbers of platforms, is e-commerce. And what's interesting, when you look globally, there's just a huge amount of activity taking place now in Africa, Southeast Asia, India, Latin America, where these platform business models are appearing, and lots of activity to build e-commerce platforms. And I think that's a function both of the understanding of the significance and power of companies like Amazon, but also the proliferation and market penetration of mobile technologies. And so basically, most people in the world who are middle class, so you have this surgence of the rise of the middle class in the emerging markets. They now have connectivity, and these platforms are emerging in which they're doing lots of business. So that sector is pretty hot. And then you've got fintech, followed by business tools and services. Social, obviously, is a big category as well. And then you have media, messaging, transportation, travel, real estate is an interesting one as well. So you can imagine matching platforms in real estate, and I think that has a lot of growth potential. Internet search, and then mobile applications. This is what the map looks like. If you take the numbers of platforms and you plot them across the world, and you can see we are right now in the epicenter, right, of platforms. There are 44 big platforms. So these are platforms with market caps of $1 billion or more. So these are the big ones around the world. In North America is the largest number, followed by Asia. Right, and it's interesting, in the tech media, it's really hard to find out what's going on. The tech media doesn't cover Asia all that much. The tech media seems to like to report a lot on what's going on in the Valley, but there's a ton of activity taking place in Asia, and it makes sense. Asia is now the largest economy in the world if you aggregate China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and India. So you can imagine there's going to be a lot of platforms because there's a lot of people and there's a lot of economic wealth to tap into. Beijing is very active. There's almost 30 platforms with $1 billion or more market cap in Beijing alone. So Beijing has got a lot of activity. What's really interesting is Europe is lagging significantly. Europeans are big users of platforms, So I call them platform services, are in high demand in Europe, and you see a lot of people using them, but Europe has not generated their own platforms. So there are a number of them out there, but they tend to be quite small. There's a variety of reasons for this, but it's creating a lot of angst, both amongst the companies, but also the policymakers as to what's going on and how do we change the situation. And so Annabelle Gower and I call this platform anxiety that has emerged. And an interesting question is how is Europe going to respond to this? Are they going to do things that just nurture and help cultivate their own, or are they going to impose actions that block American platforms from operating in Europe? And we're seeing both of those actions being played out. This shows you the market capitalization. And in the San Francisco Bay Area, the numbers are really big. I mean, it is much bigger than I anticipated. So you're talking a market cap of $2.2 trillion. And it's one reason this highway out here is so crowded. There's just a lot of activity happening place. And the housing prices, to me, because it's just, wealth begets great things, but also headaches along the way. And so a tremendous amount of wealth being generated. Seattle is actually not bad because you've got Microsoft and Amazon there. New York is pretty small. People say, oh, New York's this up-and-coming tech center and stuff, but most of them are transaction platforms. Many of them are really small. And so, in my view, New York is not quite as hot as they would like to think. Asia, lots of activity. Beijing just alone, $245 billion in market cap of the platform companies there. And then you've got kind of these different hubs that are taking place in China through Hangzhou and Shenzhen and Shanghai. So it's not all concentrated in China. It's actually fairly dispersed. Tokyo's got a bit, and India now a bit more activity. And then again, Europe is, I think, significantly lagging, at least in terms of scale platforms. So only London and Berlin pop up in our survey. This is the wealth generation. And so this shows just the publicly traded platforms. So there are 50 of them in this set right here. And it shows the accumulated gross profits over the last 5 years. So of that, the Americas, but 98% of that is the U.S., have captured $1.3 trillion in gross profits. This is not revenue, this is profits, right? So there's a huge amount of wealth being generated by these platform companies. Europe is far behind with 87 billion. Asia, about 230. In Africa, there's one very large company called Naspers, which is doing pretty well, but a large amount of its wealth is generated from investments it made in China. Okay, now I think if you think back to the 1960s and 70s and 80s, there was lots of debate about the multinational firm, and you think about the multinational firm as being either a telecoms company or a mining company or an oil company that goes into the third world and invests in resources or kind of manufacturing. But there's a whole new breed of multinationals that are emerging. Airbnb now does business in 34,000 cities around the world in 190 countries. So, we think of Airbnb as being this cute little internet company, but it's not. It's a multinational corporation with operations all over the world. Paris is its most important city. It has 28,000 listings in Paris. So it's just it's like all Parisians that have any space have put their space on Airbnb. Netflix has 70 million users in over 190 countries around the world. And this is a stunning statistic. Users watch more than 125 million hours of TV shows and movies per day. Wow. You can see why Hollywood is a little nervous about these. LinkedIn, I mentioned before, 200 countries. 70% of the users are outside the United States now, so it's truly a global company. Over 100 million users access LinkedIn each month, so it's a very active platform. And then obviously Google is all over the place, and I mapped just Google Play, and you can see that I think you can call Google a multinational corporation. based on this map because they've got operations all over. But again, it's not the conventional, right? These are digital, and so it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a physical footprint everywhere with buildings and, you know, factories and things of that nature, but it's this digital presence that allows Google to reach countries all over the world. And then, of course, there's this wealth effect that allows you to go out and get the most highly prized architectural firms in the world. And so these are the headquarters buildings that have just been completed or are under construction. And, you know, they get Frank Gehry and some of the top architectural firms to, I guess, as a statement to what they're doing in the world. So, data, we heard this earlier, is critical to platforms. And I took Crunchbase, which is a great, you know, source, but it's hard to work with unless you have the whole data set. So I was able to get a copy of the whole data set. It was about 23,000 firms, and I dumped it into Tableau. And I did a little search, and I said, I wonder how many companies have data in their name. Well, it turns out there are over 100 that have data in their name in the last 5 years, and they've been able to raise $1.4 billion. So it's pretty, I think, a testament to how valuable data has become and the ability to organize a firm or a small business around data. My favorite on this list is right in the center. It's called American Prison Data Systems. You can imagine there's a fair amount of data associated with the American system. So APIs, and I think this crowd knows this very well. And so I've been interested in understanding the API world. This is a map that we built of all the open APIs that are posted or listed on Programmable Web's website. So there are 12,000 of them. And the nodes represent the number of mashups that have been built on top of those APIs. So you can begin to see what this emerging API economy looks like and who the main players are. And it turns out many of the main players are platform companies, right? And what they're doing is they're opening their API to allow other companies to build applications on top of them. And I found this very useful to help me understand sort of what companies are up to and who are kind of establishing themselves for the next generation of business opportunities. This is the same data set, but it takes away the black because I wanted to highlight the difference between Amazon and Walmart. So these are the open APIs that Amazon has, and there are over 360 open APIs that Amazon has. And you can see they're clustered in different areas. I've got the color coding of the different sectors in which these APIs exist. And you can imagine, where do you think Walmart is in this map? Do you think it's central to the API economy? No, it's way out on the periphery, and it only has one API that's open, and nobody's built anything on top of it. Now, what's really interesting is that most analysts compare Amazon and Walmart as retail establishments. But the minute you look at this, you begin to realize Amazon is going off in a different direction, right? And what it is doing, I believe, and I'm sure this group would be a great group to discuss this with, is I believe we're seeing the evolution or the emergence of what I call Internet of Things information infrastructure companies. So these are companies that provide the underlying infrastructure, the data, the information infrastructure on top of which many other companies will build applications. We heard a great example of that with the what was it called? The Google Marketplace. I mean, that's kind of like an Internet of Things information infrastructure company for small businesses. Well, Amazon's doing this in a whole host of ways. And so I think what will be interesting is to pick out where these companies are emerging and who the key players will be in this emerging Internet of Things information infrastructure play going forward, because many of the small businesses can provide services to those, but also will need to leverage them because they don't have enough capability to do so. So platforms and strategy, this is really interesting. I think everybody here in the room knows about Michael Porter and Five Forces. Well, it turns out Five Force analysis doesn't really work that well in thinking about platforms because it's not about resource control. So they're kind of key features that you think about in traditional strategy, right? Which is, how do you control those resources to have competitive advantage in the marketplace? How do you optimize your internal operations, right? Squeeze your supply chain. That's kind of a great Walmart strategy. And then focus on product, right? So you incentivize your product line leaders to maximize value. Well, in a platform play, those strategies don't work as well, because it's more about orchestrating resources, right? You've got a network, you've got an ecosystem, and so you really have to think about, how do you orchestrate, how do you facilitate that exchange for the marketplaces and things of that nature. And also, how do you facilitate that external interaction? This isn't necessarily about optimizing your internal organization, but thinking about how you facilitate exchange in the marketplace. And then also, it's not just about maximizing the value of particular products, it's about maximizing the value of the entire ecosystem. And that's a totally different approach and set of criteria that you might establish for thinking about strategy. There's also a lot of interesting work that's been done around how do you launch platforms, because platforms face a chicken and egg problem. You got to have users on one side and supply on the other, and how do you get that going? More details about this are in that book, Platform Revolution, but I just throw out the fact that there's not just one way to launch a platform. There are many different ways that companies have focused on, and the beauty is today you don't have to go through the school of hard knocks. You can actually study what has been done in the past, understand your market conditions, and pick, I think, more likely a more successful strategy as to how to go about the launch. Another really interesting question is around platforms and incumbents, and that is, you've got these startup companies that are establishing platforms. What about the existing incumbent firms, right? The big ones that exist. And what I've realized in doing this research is that there's an interesting relationship between your traditional organizational structure and the platforms. So we've been talking about these asset-light companies that have small organizations, small physical footprints, but very large ecosystems. We also have kind of a mixed case. I would throw Amazon in that, because they have very large fulfillment centers that are huge investment of capital, but they also have these huge ecosystems. But we also have these kind of traditional firms that have these traditional organizations that are very large, but are now trying to nurture platforms. And there's a lot of examples out there. So Daimler, for example, has gone out and bought ride-sharing companies because it's trying to figure out how to be successful in the shift to mobility rather than just manufacturing cars. GE has launched its Predix platform to try to facilitate machine-to-machine exchange and learning, and try to encourage other companies to build applications on its platform. Samsung is trying to figure out how to move out of just producing devices into platforms as well. So when we think about platforms, I think it's important to think about them in relation to kind of the traditional firm and this split out. One great example is IBM. Right? We all know about the Watson story. The initial R&D was done in 2006. Then they did the Jeopardy, which really put them on the map. And then they began to focus on particular sectors. What's really interesting is more recently they have morphed into a platform play. And I think this is the emergence of an interesting kind of evolution of IBM. So they've got their platform services, but what's really interesting is that they have actively gone out and built partnerships with more than 350 companies to build applications and capabilities that enhance the value of Watson. And that is a real platform play in my view. And they've created a Watson App Store. So they're kind of following in this kind of well-trod path of how you create an ecosystem and to enhance a platform play. You can also think about companies that have big physical assets deployed. It's amazing how many vending machines Coke has around the world. They spend more than $1 billion a year just servicing those vending machines, but they're all kind of dumb and just serving drinks, right? But you can do all sorts of things with them, right? So you can create hotspots for them, and they're doing that in the emerging markets. You can also put iBeacons on them and use them as a foundation for proximity marketing, on top of which small businesses can now do loyalty programs and a whole host of other applications. And they're able to do that because they have a huge infrastructure already out there in the field. What they're doing is putting smarts on it, right, and this whole Internet of Things capability. So that's important to watch, because Coke's not the only big firm out there with lots of assets, and so thinking about how these big firms are going to build out assets in the future and make them smart, and how you might be able to dovetail or create capabilities there, I think is an interesting play. I guess I'll end with this, which is not all platforms are successful. Do you know what this is? This is GE's EV charger device, right? And they had this great idea of making it into a platform, right? And why not? The iPhone exists. They could do the same thing with the charger, but it really hasn't worked. So, and the reason is that it hasn't deployed very quickly, right? There's huge coordination costs associated with getting customers to buy this thing and put them in their house. It's even harder to get cities to deploy them. And so the deployment of the device that they had just rolled out very, very slowly and really didn't catch fire. And, you know, it's going along a little bit. The product leader of this product didn't like it when I posted this on Twitter. He follows me now, but I used to work for GE, so it's the only reason I know about that case. Okay, so it's, just to wrap up, I think it's really interesting to think about where the next platform's going to be. I think agriculture is underserved, and it's a really interesting play. And you can think of a whole host of ways in which platforms could emerge, everything from drones to better asset allocation of tractors. I just talked to a CEO of a company that's starting up in Africa to use an app to better allocate mini tractors to farmers, because the upfront cost of buying a tractor is a lot. So if you can better utilize it, you can get more likelihood to diffuse tractors. Energy is super interesting, you know, with the rise of distributed energy with solar, and there's been some experimentation now with blockchain and being able to do the micropayments that you need to be able to pay users of the electricity with the suppliers of the electricity. You got to get the utility to agree to use the transmission lines, but lots of interesting potential for platforms to emerge there. Healthcare is another space where I think we're going to see tons of platforms emerge. And then clearly the financial banking system, you know, in the past they try to build customers by building out all these small retail establishments. I think that's going away, and we're going to see more digital plays. And it's all about how you fuse this data layer with the physical layer and tap into that ecosystem. So positioning for the future, I think the research at least is convinced me that we're rapidly moving into a platform economy, and that platform strategies beat traditional product strategies. And then platforms formations, has it plateaued? I don't think so. I think we're going to see continued growth of platforms, not just in the United States, but globally. And it's going to be interesting to see how that morphs, particularly as companies like Amazon build out that information infrastructure layer on top of which you can build all sorts of interesting applications. And so the question then I can revert back to you is, what platforms can you grow and build for your business and to benefit others? So I don't know if I have any time for, I have one or two questions. Yes, sir. Sure. How much time do you want to spend? So I'm a big believer in buying like 4 books and reading them at the same time because every author approaches it differently. This idea of taking one and reading it, so I would recommend reading the report I just wrote on the rise of the platform enterprise. It's free. You can download it off our website at the Center for Global Enterprise. Platform Revolution is a great book. The authors have spent more than 15 years studying platforms, and they've read they've written their book to make it accessible to a broader population. There's a new book, Matchmakers, that I'm just reading right now by Schmalensee and Evans, and it's good. It's got lots of nice case studies in it. So those are 2 or 3 that I would recommend now. Yeah. That is a super hard question because there are multiple types of platforms in different sectors. One thing that I would point out is there's a really interesting move to portfolio plays. So you're seeing the rise of companies like Priceline, and they have many platforms underneath them. So I think obviously there's this hard bit of establishing a market and understanding how do you get to both sides. So this book I just mentioned, Matchmakers, has a great story about how OpenTable was established. And it took them a long time, right, to get it all worked out. And first they provided tools, and then they recognized that there was value in bringing the customers in and creating the whole ecosystem around that. So I think it's thinking about what is that broader ecosystem, and then there's, I think, a well-trod path now where VCs understand the platforms, and you convince them that you have a platform play, you're likely to get money, and then the growth trajectory of it so it's a tough one to answer. So I'm getting cut off here, but appreciate it, and follow me on Twitter. I post a ton about platforms, and thank you very much for having the opportunity to speak.